Think you know everything about 1950s biblical epics? Think again. Behind the sword-and-sandal spectacle of this Roman arena adventure lies a treasure trove of bizarre production secrets, from Australian parrots in ancient Rome to tiger teeth removals and scenes literally stolen from the future. Here are the 15 weird facts you didn't know about Demetrius and the Gladiators. Fact 1. Filmed before its predecessor was released. In one of the most audacious gambles in Hollywood history, 20th Century Fox began production on Demetrius and the Gladiators before they even knew if audiences would like the robe. The sequel was not only planned but completely finished filming by September 1953, months before the robe hit theaters in September of that same year. This meant that studio executives were so confident in their biblical epic that they immediately greenlit and shot an entire follow-up film based purely on their own expectations rather than actual box office results or audience reactions. The decision was driven by studio chief Darryl F. Zanuck, who recognized the revolutionary potential of their new CinemaScope widescreen technology and wanted to capitalize on it as quickly as possible. The rushed timeline created some fascinating behind-the-scenes logistics. Since the robe was still in post-production when Demetrius began filming, the crew had to work with sets, costumes, and props that were still being used for the original film. This explains why many of the same elaborate Roman sets appear in both movies, creating a seamless visual continuity that audiences assumed was planned but was actually born out of practical necessity. Actor Jay Robinson, who played the deranged Emperor Caligula in both films, later revealed that there was only a 3-week gap between wrapping the robe and starting work on the sequel. This breakneck pace meant that cast and crew barely had time to catch their breath before diving back into ancient Rome. The gamble paid off spectacularly when the robe became a massive hit, validating Fox's bold decision to produce its sequel sight unseen. Demetrius and the Gladiators went on to earn $26 million in North America and became one of the highest-grossing films of 1954, proving that sometimes the biggest risks lead to the biggest rewards in Hollywood. Fact 2. Only 3-week production gap. Jay Robinson, who brought the maniacal Emperor Caligula to terrifying life on screen, revealed one of the most startling details about the production schedule that even most film historians don't know. According to Robinson himself, there were only 3 weeks between finishing work on the robe and beginning principal photography on Demetrius and the Gladiators, creating what might be the shortest turnaround time between a major film and its sequel in Hollywood history. This incredibly compressed timeline meant that actors, crew members, and craftspeople barely had time to process their work on the first film before diving headfirst into recreating ancient Rome all over again. For Robinson specifically, this meant maintaining his intense psychological preparation for playing one of history's most unstable rulers across 2 separate film shoots with almost no break in between. The 3-week gap also created practical challenges that most audiences never considered. Costume departments had to quickly clean, repair, and reorganize elaborate Roman togas, armor, and period clothing that had just been used extensively during months of filming. Set decorators needed to reconfigure the same massive Roman palace and arena sets that were still being dismantled from the robe's final scenes. What makes this timeline even more remarkable is that Demetrius and the Gladiators wasn't a small-budget quickie sequel, but a major CinemaScope epic in its own right, featuring elaborate gladiatorial combat scenes, complex political intrigue, and the same high production values as its predecessor. The fact that 20th Century Fox managed to mount such an ambitious production with virtually no downtime speaks to both the studio system's efficiency and the incredible dedication of everyone involved. Robinson's revelation also explains why both films share such seamless visual continuity and why the performances feel so naturally connected, since the actors were essentially living in these characters' worlds for months on end, with barely any interruption between the 2 stories. Fact 3. Scenes stolen from the future. In a bizarre twist of film production logistics, the opening gladiatorial arena scene that audiences see in the robe was actually filmed for Demetrius and the Gladiators and then borrowed backward in time to use in the original movie. This means that viewers watching the robe are technically seeing footage from its own sequel without realizing it, creating one of the strangest cases of cinematic time travel in Hollywood history. The scene features actors who had no business being in the robe at all, including Susan Hayward as the seductive Messalina, Ernest Borgnine as the gruff gladiator trainer Strabo, William Marshall as the noble fighter Glycon, and Richard Egan as the villainous Dardanius. These four major characters appear prominently in the arena sequence that opens the robe, despite never appearing anywhere else in that film because they were never meant to be part of the original story. This unusual arrangement happened because the production schedules overlapped so dramatically that footage was being shot for the sequel while the original film was still being assembled in the editing room. When editors realized they needed a dramatic opening sequence to establish the brutal world of Roman entertainment, they simply reached into the sequel's already completed gladiatorial scenes and pulled out what they needed. The borrowed footage creates an interesting viewing experience for anyone who watches both films in order, since characters from Demetrius and the Gladiators essentially make cameo appearances in the robe before their proper introductions in the sequel. Jay Robinson, who played Caligula in both films, confirmed this unusual production detail years later, explaining how the compressed timeline between the two movies led to this creative solution that nobody at the time thought audiences would ever notice or analyze. Fact 4. Tiger had teeth removed. Sharp-eyed viewers who watch Demetrius and the Gladiators closely will notice something unsettling during one of the film's most dramatic sequences, where the hero faces off against a pack of hungry tigers in the Roman arena. In a close-up shot that shows one of the tigers growling menacingly at the camera, the animal's top canine teeth are clearly missing, revealing the extreme safety measures that 1950s filmmakers took to protect their human actors during these dangerous scenes. The missing teeth weren't the result of an accident or natural loss, but a deliberate modification made specifically for the film production. This practice was part of the standard safety protocols used by Hollywood animal trainers when working with large predators in close proximity to actors, especially during intense action sequences that required the animals to appear aggressive and threatening on camera. Victor Mature, who played the title character Demetrius, had to perform several scenes where he was physically close to these modified tigers, including moments where he appears to be fighting them with only a sword and shield for protection. The removed canine teeth significantly reduced the risk of serious injury if something went wrong during filming, though the tigers were still dangerous enough that extensive safety precautions and professional animal handlers were required on set at all times. What makes this detail particularly noticeable is that the close-up shot was clearly intended to showcase the tiger's fierce, predatory nature and build tension for the audience, but instead, it inadvertently documented the behind-the-scenes safety measures for anyone paying close attention. The scene still achieves its dramatic effect for most viewers, who are focused on the overall action rather than examining the tiger's dental work. But film enthusiasts who know what to look for can easily spot this telltale sign of 1950s movie magic and animal safety practices. Fact 5. Australian bird in ancient Rome. During the scenes where Claudius and Messalina are interviewing Demetrius about his Christian beliefs, viewers can spot what appears to be an exotic parrot perched on a stand next to Messalina's luxurious couch, seemingly representing the kind of rare and beautiful creature that would befit a wealthy Roman senator's wife. However, the bird is actually a sulfur-crested cockatoo, a species that is completely indigenous to Australia and would have been absolutely impossible to find in ancient Rome during the 1st century. This creates a fascinating historical impossibility, since Australia remained completely unknown to the Western world for over 1,500 years after the film's setting. European explorers didn't reach Australia until the 17th century, and even then, it took considerable time before Australian wildlife began making its way to other continents as exotic pets or curiosities for wealthy collectors. The sulfur-crested cockatoo is easily recognizable by its distinctive white plumage and bright yellow crest that rises when the bird is excited or alert, making it quite different from the parrots that would have actually been available to wealthy Romans of that era. Romans did keep exotic birds as pets and status symbols, but they would have been limited to species from Africa, Asia, or other parts of Europe, and the Mediterranean region that were accessible through existing trade routes. The presence of this distinctly Australian bird suggests that the film's prop department simply used whatever exotic-looking bird was available from their animal suppliers without considering the historical accuracy of the choice. In the context of a 1950s Hollywood production, when audiences were less likely to scrutinize such details, and when access to information about historical accuracy was more limited, this kind of anachronistic animal choice would have easily gone unnoticed by most viewers who were focused on the drama unfolding between the characters rather than examining the wildlife in the background. Fact 6. Michelangelo's David time traveled. Among the impressive collection of marble statues that surround Emperor Caligula's throne in the imperial palace scenes, one sculpture stands out as a remarkable example of artistic time travel that somehow escaped the notice of the film's historical consultants. Sharp-eyed viewers can spot what appears to be Michelangelo's famous statue of David, positioned prominently in the background, creating one of the most glaring anachronisms in the entire film. The real David was completed by Michelangelo Buonarroti in 1503 during the height of the Italian Renaissance, making it over 1,400 years newer than the first-century Roman setting of Demetrius and the Gladiators. This means that the statue seen in Caligula's throne room wouldn't actually exist for another millennium and a half after the events depicted in the movie. Michelangelo's David is one of the most recognizable sculptures in art history, standing over 14 feet tall and carved from a single block of white Carrara marble. The statue depicts the biblical hero David as a muscular young man preparing to face the giant Goliath, and it represents the pinnacle of Renaissance artistic achievement and humanistic ideals that were completely foreign to ancient Roman culture. The inclusion of this Renaissance masterpiece in a first-century Roman palace setting creates an interesting puzzle about how it ended up in the film. It's possible that the set decorators used a reproduction of the famous statue simply because it looked appropriately classical and impressive, without considering the historical timeline. Alternatively, they may have assumed that most audience members wouldn't recognize the specific sculpture or notice the chronological impossibility of its presence in ancient Rome. The statue's appearance in the film serves as a fascinating reminder of how Hollywood productions of the 1950s often prioritized visual impact and grandeur over strict historical accuracy, creating memorable scenes that mixed authentic historical elements with recognizable artistic references from completely different time periods. Fact 7. Electric poles in ancient Rome. During one of the film's most dramatic gladiatorial arena sequences, as the camera pans left across the royal box where Emperor Caligula and his entourage are watching the deadly combat below, attentive viewers can spot something that definitely doesn't belong in first-century Rome. In the background, clearly visible among the trees beyond the arena, stands a modern electric utility pole complete with power lines stretching across the landscape, creating one of the most obvious examples of 20th century technology accidentally appearing in an ancient world setting. This glaring anachronism somehow made it through the entire production process, from filming through editing to final release, without anyone catching the mistake or attempting to remove it through careful framing or post-production techniques. The electric pole and wires are visible for several seconds during the scene, making them impossible to miss for anyone who happens to be looking at that part of the screen rather than focusing on the action in the arena itself. The presence of modern electrical infrastructure in what's supposed to be ancient Rome represents a particularly jarring break from the film's otherwise carefully constructed historical atmosphere. The production designers and set decorators went to great lengths to create authentic-looking Roman architecture, costumes, and props, making the accidental inclusion of modern power lines all the more noticeable when they appear on screen. This type of continuity error was more common in 1950s film productions, when shooting locations were often chosen for their visual appeal or practical considerations rather than their complete historical accuracy. The arena scenes were likely filmed at a location that provided the right kind of architectural backdrop and space for the elaborate gladiatorial sequences, but the crew apparently didn't notice or couldn't avoid the modern electrical equipment that was part of the surrounding infrastructure. The mistake serves as a reminder that even big-budget Hollywood epics with extensive period detail can still contain obvious signs of the modern world. Fact 8. Retractable prop daggers. Throughout the film's numerous stabbing scenes, from the gladiatorial combat in the arena to Demetrius's violent confrontations with fellow fighters, viewers who pay close attention will notice something peculiar about the weapons being used. Despite the dramatic action and apparent brutality of these encounters, there's never any blood visible on either the daggers themselves or on the victims who are supposedly being stabbed, revealing the ingenious safety mechanisms that 1950s prop masters used to create realistic-looking violence. The explanation lies in the sophisticated retractable blade system built into the prop daggers used throughout the production. These specially designed weapons featured blades that would automatically retreat into their handles the moment they made contact with an actor's body, creating the visual appearance of a stabbing motion without any actual penetration or danger to the performers. This clever mechanical design allowed actors like Victor Mature to engage in intense, close-quarters combat scenes that looked genuinely dangerous and violent on screen while maintaining complete safety for everyone involved. When Demetrius stabs a tiger during the arena sequence, for example, the blade appears to penetrate the animal's light-colored underside multiple times, but careful observation reveals that neither the tiger nor the dagger shows any trace of blood that would be expected from such wounds. The same retractable mechanism is clearly visible during the climactic fight scene, where Demetrius kills several gladiators in revenge for what he believes was Lucia's death. Despite the apparent ferocity of these attacks and the dramatic way the victims fall to the ground, the daggers emerge from each encounter completely clean, and the actors show no signs of the injuries that would have resulted from real blade contact. This prop technology represented the cutting edge of movie special effects during the 1950s, allowing filmmakers to create convincing violence without relying on the more obvious editing techniques or camera tricks that might have broken the illusion for audiences. Fact 9. Julie Newmar's secret debut. Hidden among the dancing entertainers who perform for the decadent Roman court scenes is a young woman who would later become one of television's most iconic villains, though audiences in 1954 had no way of knowing they were watching the future Catwoman in one of her earliest film appearances. Julie Newmar, who was credited under her birth name Julie Newmyer, appears uncredited as a specialty dancer during the elaborate party sequences that showcase the luxurious and morally corrupt lifestyle of the Roman elite. At the time of filming, Newmar was just 21 years old and working as a professional dancer and choreographer for Universal Studios, taking whatever roles she could find to build her career in Hollywood. Her appearance in Demetrius and the Gladiators came during a period when she was accepting small, often uncredited parts as a dancer in various films, including roles as a dancer assassin in Slaves of Babylon and the Gilded Girl in Serpent of the Nile, both released in 1953. The dancing scenes in which Newmar appears were designed to emphasize the sensual and hedonistic atmosphere of Roman high society, particularly in the sequences involving Messalina's elaborate entertainments for the gladiators and court officials. These performances required skilled dancers who could convey both elegance and seductive appeal, making Newmar's classical ballet training and striking physical presence perfect for the role. What makes this early appearance particularly fascinating is that it occurred more than a decade before Newmar would achieve lasting fame as Catwoman in the Batman television series, from 1966 to 1967. Her brief, uncredited performance in this biblical epic represents a completely different phase of her career, when she was still working to establish herself in Hollywood and taking whatever opportunities came her way, regardless of how small or uncredited they might be. Fact 10. Franz Waxman's insane 1954 schedule. The year 1954 was absolutely extraordinary for composer Franz Waxman, who somehow managed to write complete musical scores for 6 different major motion pictures within the span of 12 months, creating what might be the most productive single year in film music history. This incredible workload included not only the sweeping biblical epic Demetrius and the Gladiators, but also Alfred Hitchcock's suspenseful masterpiece Rear Window for Paramount Pictures and Paul Newman's early biblical drama The Silver Chalice for Warner Brothers. Waxman was at the absolute peak of his career during this period, having just won back-to-back Academy Awards for Best Score with Sunset Boulevard in 1950 and A Place in the Sun in 1951. This success made him one of the most sought-after composers in Hollywood, with multiple studios competing for his services and offering him prestigious projects that required his distinctive musical style and dramatic sensibility. The other three films that Waxman scored during this remarkably busy year were Prince Valiant, Elephant Walk, and This Is My Love, representing an incredible variety of genres from medieval adventure to contemporary romance to exotic drama. Each of these scores required completely different musical approaches, orchestrations, and thematic development, meaning that Waxman was essentially creating 6 entirely separate musical worlds within the same time period that most composers would use to complete just 1 or 2 projects. What makes this achievement even more impressive is that Waxman was known for his meticulous attention to detail and thorough research into each project's historical and cultural background. For Demetrius and the Gladiators specifically, he had to create music that would complement the existing themes from Alfred Newman's score for The Robe, while establishing his own distinct musical identity for the sequel, requiring careful balance between continuity and originality that demanded extensive time and creative energy. Fact 11. Wine-stained continuity chaos. During the climactic confrontation scene near the end of the film, when the vengeful Messalina throws wine at the Apostle Peter in a fit of rage, viewers can witness one of the most obvious continuity errors in the entire production as the wine stains on Peter's clothing mysteriously transform between camera angles. The scene begins with wine clearly staining Peter's white undergarment on his shoulder and dripping down onto the chest area of his outer draped tunic, creating prominent dark spots that are impossible to miss. However, when the camera cuts to a different angle just seconds later, the wine stains have undergone a dramatic transformation that defies the basic laws of physics and liquid behavior. Peter now has only a much smaller wine spot visible on his shoulder, while the dripping stains that were clearly visible on the chest of his outer tunic have completely vanished, without any explanation or logical reason for their disappearance. The continuity chaos doesn't end there, because when the camera switches back to the original angle, both stains have mysteriously reappeared in their full glory, with Peter once again displaying both the shoulder stain and the prominent chest markings exactly as they appeared in the initial shot. This back-and-forth transformation of the wine stains creates a dizzying effect for anyone who's paying attention to the details of Peter's costume, rather than focusing solely on the dramatic dialogue between the characters. This type of continuity error typically occurs when scenes are filmed out of sequence, or when multiple takes are shot with different costume preparations, and the editing team fails to notice the inconsistencies when assembling the final cut. The wine-throwing scene was likely filmed multiple times from different angles, with costume assistants having to recreate the stains for each setup, resulting in slightly different stain patterns that became glaringly obvious when edited together in rapid succession during this emotionally charged moment in the story. Fact 12. Historical Caligula mix-up. In one of the opening scenes of the film, Emperor Caligula is shown receiving and reading official reports from Pontius Pilate about events in Judea, creating what appears to be a routine example of imperial administration, but actually represents a significant historical impossibility that reveals the filmmaker's casual approach to chronological accuracy. The problem lies in the timing of when these two historical figures actually held their respective positions of power in the Roman Empire. Caligula didn't become emperor until 37 AD, when he succeeded his great-uncle Tiberius after a reign that had lasted for over 20 years. However, Pontius Pilate had already been dismissed from his position as prefect of Judea and recalled to Rome by Emperor Tiberius sometime between 36 and 37 AD, meaning that by the time Caligula took power, Pilate was no longer serving in any official capacity that would have required him to send reports to the new emperor. Pilate had served as the Roman governor of Judea from 26 to 36 AD, making him the official responsible for maintaining order in that volatile province during the time of Jesus' crucifixion, which is why he appears as such an important figure in the Christian story that forms the backdrop of both The Robe and this sequel. His dismissal came after a series of complaints about his harsh treatment of the local population and his failure to maintain peaceful relations between the various religious and ethnic groups under his administration. The film compounds this historical error by setting the action in 53 AD, which would place the events even further into Caligula's reign, making it completely impossible for Pilate to still be sending official reports from Judea. By that time, Caligula had been dead for 12 years, having been assassinated by his own Praetorian Guard in 41 AD. And Claudius was the reigning emperor, though the film portrays him merely as Caligula's uncle rather than as his successor. Fact 13. Hollywood's first true sequel. Demetrius and the Gladiators holds a unique place in cinema history as one of the first legitimate movie sequels ever produced by a major Hollywood studio, representing a bold experiment in storytelling that would eventually become one of the most common practices in the film industry. Before 1954, the concept of creating a direct continuation of a dramatic film story was almost unheard of in Hollywood, where studio executives generally preferred to develop completely original projects rather than risk building on existing narratives. The few sequels that did exist before this film were typically limited to comedy series featuring popular characters like Abbott and Costello, or crime dramas that followed detective characters through multiple adventures, but these were essentially independent stories featuring the same protagonists, rather than genuine narrative continuations. The only notable examples of true dramatic sequels were rare exceptions like Going My Way in 1944, and its follow-up The Bells of St. Mary's in 1945, which featured Bing Crosby reprising his role as Father O'Malley. 20th Century Fox's decision to create a direct sequel to The Robe was considered highly experimental and risky by industry standards of the time, since there was no proven formula for success with this type of project. Studio executives had to convince skeptical board members and investors that audiences would be interested in returning to the same fictional world and following the continuing adventures of characters they had already seen in a previous film. The success of Demetrius and the Gladiators proved that audiences were indeed hungry for more stories, set in worlds they had already come to know and love, establishing a precedent that would eventually lead to the sequel-heavy film industry we know today. The film's impressive box office performance of $26 million demonstrated that sequels could be just as profitable as original productions, paving the way for the countless follow-ups, franchises, and shared universes that would dominate Hollywood in later decades. Fact 14. Set recycling from different location. Sharp-eyed viewers who watch both The Robe and Demetrius and the Gladiators will notice that one of the most recognizable locations appears in both films, but represents completely different geographical settings that are hundreds of miles apart in the ancient world. The Christian neighborhood set that appears in Rome during Demetrius and the Gladiators was previously used in The Robe to represent the village of Cana in Galilee, where Jesus performed his first miracle of turning water into wine. The telltale identifying feature that makes this set recycling obvious is a distinctive stone well surrounded by old broken columns that appears prominently in both films, creating an unmistakable visual landmark that careful viewers can easily recognize despite the different contexts in which it appears. In The Robe, this well serves as a central gathering place for the village of Cana, where Marcellus encounters the local Christian community and begins to understand their faith and way of life. When the same set appears in Demetrius and the Gladiators, it has been redressed and rearranged to represent a poor Christian neighborhood within the city of Rome itself, where Demetrius visits his friend Caeso and meets the young woman Lucia, who becomes central to his spiritual journey. The production designers made some efforts to modify the appearance of the location by adding different props and changing some of the architectural details, but the basic structure and that distinctive well remain clearly identifiable. This type of set recycling was a common practice in 1950s Hollywood production, where the enormous cost of building elaborate period sets made it economically sensible to reuse them for multiple projects whenever possible. The compressed production schedule between The Robe and its sequel made this practice almost inevitable, since the sets were still standing and available when filming began on Demetrius and the Gladiators, allowing the production team to save both time and money while maintaining the high production values that audiences expected from a major biblical epic. Fact 15. Composers Academy Protest. Franz Waxman made one of the most dramatic gestures of professional protest in Academy Awards history during 1954, when he resigned his membership from the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences to express his outrage over what he considered a shocking oversight in that year's nominations. The Academy had inexplicably failed to nominate Alfred Newman's magnificent musical score for The Robe, which Waxman regarded as one of the finest achievements in film music composition and a work that clearly deserved recognition alongside the year's other outstanding scores. Waxman's decision to resign from the Academy was particularly significant because he was at the absolute peak of his own career at the time, having just won consecutive Academy Awards for Best Score with Sunset Boulevard in 1950 and A Place in the Sun in 1951. As one of the most respected and successful composers in Hollywood, his resignation carried considerable weight and sent a clear message about the Academy's credibility when it came to recognizing excellence in film music. This passionate defense of Newman's work made Waxman's assignment to compose the score for Demetrius and the Gladiators even more personally meaningful, since he was essentially being asked to follow up and complement the very musical achievement that he had fought to defend through his Academy protest. Waxman approached the project with enormous respect for Newman's original themes, carefully incorporating several of the majestic motifs from The Robe while still creating his own distinctive musical identity for the sequel. The irony of the situation was that Waxman ended up creating what many critics and film music enthusiasts consider to be an equally brilliant score for the sequel, demonstrating his ability to honor Newman's work while establishing his own creative voice within the same musical universe. His protest had been vindicated not through Academy recognition, but through the lasting quality and impact of both composers' contributions to these biblical epics that continue to be celebrated by film music lovers today.